Hi, everyone. I'm Chris Green. I'm the director of the Loyal Jones Appalachian Center, and I'm glad to welcome you to our first ever virtual Dinner on the Grounds. Now, Dinner on the Grounds is a time when communities come together to celebrate, to talk, and to share. And we're sure glad that you're here with us doing that in this venue, because in this time, it's more important than ever that we are able to stay together and find each other and talk and listen. Before I introduce Ivy Brashear, what I would like to do is just give you an overview of what we're going to be doing today, which is that Ivy's got a presentation that's going to last about 30 minutes. And then after that, we're going to have time for questions and answers. And so folks can ask those questions and answers in the Q&A box at the screen. And then when we're ready to have those questions come out, I'll be asking them and Ivy will be answering them, and we'll have a little conversation, she and I, around that right then too. So to get to it, I would like to, in introducing Ivy, I also need to introduce the Mountain Association. And the Mountain Association, which up to a few months ago was called MESA, the Mountain Association of Community Economic Development. The association began in 1986, and it is committed to really helping change the economic landscape of Eastern Kentucky. For those of you, of course, who know and are connected with Eastern Kentucky, you have a sense of it was an extraction industry, and that people had a hard time getting a foothold and building new businesses. And this is something that the Mountain Association is dedicated to. So they are able to get low-cost loans to businesses making adjustments and changes. And they're able to do that with great efficiency and thoughtfulness to people who might not be able to get them. They are also able and work with energy efficiencies, making changes so that there are grocery stores that were once losing money because of how their cooling system works that are now saving money. The third part of what the Mountain Association does is they're working for policy and narrative change. And that's where Ivy really comes in with her particular portfolio of work. Ivy is the Appalachian Transition Director and Transition to a Just Economy of the Mountain Association. And her work focuses on helping shift the narrative of Appalachia as a critical aspect of the just and equitable economic transition. And those are really important words, just and equitable. It's for everybody, and it's in a thoughtful way. She is also a freelance journalist whose writing you may have seen. She has appeared in Yes Magazine, one of my favorites, 100 Days in Appalachia, and also on Spotlight on Poverty and Opportunity. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Ivy.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks for that introduction. I'm really happy to be with everyone today to talk a little bit about storytelling and narrative change in Appalachia. Started here. So as Chris said, I'm the Appalachian Transition Director at the Mountain Association, and much of my work focuses on storytelling and narrative change, and also on policy. And those three things all working together, we're all trying to build a new narrative about Appalachia, and one that shifts away from a very different narrative than the one we're trying to build, and a different future that we're trying to build. So I'm going to start by telling y'all a story. I'm a storyteller. That's what I do. So this is my Granny Della on her porch with her beloved flowers and plants that she used to tend on that porch. Long before I was born, several years before I was born, she lived in this house, and there was a strip mine at the head of the holler. And this is the holler, the left fork of Mesas Creek, where I'm from and where I grew up. And there was a strip mine there, and there were coal trucks. They were running coal day and night up the holler and taking it out, coming back in, that kind of thing. And it was really getting her porch really dirty. The coal dust was getting inside of her house even, and making her furniture dirty and her house dirty. And Granny Della was a woman who was really bound to this code of Clorox and Windex, and she really liked to keep a very clean house. And one day she just had enough, and she pulled her Cadillac long ways across the road. There's some other images of Granny in her much younger days. But she pulled her Cadillac across the road, and she took her .38 pistol that she had in her purse, that she carried in her purse with her. And she stood there with her Cadillac and she stopped the coal trucks for that day. Now, if you had only heard this story about my Granny Della, knowing that she was from Eastern Kentucky, knowing that she was from Appalachia, you might think one of two things. You might think she was this crazy old granny woman, or she was this anti-coal activist. But the truth of her and the truth of that story is a whole lot more layered than that. And that's kind of the whole point that I'm going to make in this presentation, is that in order to see the full truth about anything, about any person, any place, any idea, you have to see it from multiple different angles, and you have to really search for the complexity in there. Nothing can be just one thing. And really, that's the power of stories. Stories really shape our entire understanding of ourselves, of our family, of our community, of the world around us, and how we fit into that world. And that's really a tale that's old as time. Humans have always been storytellers. Even from our earliest days of being human, we were telling stories to help each other survive. We were telling stories to help define the world around us and define our place within that world. We were telling stories as entertainment, and through plays and through fantastical tales to entertain ourselves. And we were using story as a way to define our sense of ourself and to explain major occurrences like weather that we couldn't explain in other ways. And again, this is all because stories help shape who we understand ourselves to be. They organize the world around us and help us to explain that. There's a scholar, Stuart Hall, who came up with this idea of cultural studies. And cultural studies theory has this pillar of it that says that the stories that we tell are not just telling the story of that thing, but they are actually also constructing that thing or that idea or that person that we're trying to talk about. And there's also a professor at EKU, Melissa Newman, who has been doing a lot of research about positive stories and how if we can put a lot of positive stories about something into local media, then those positive stories start to change people's understanding about whatever that story is about, whether it be the economy or that community. So these are just some thoughts about the power of story and how powerful stories are. So one thing to remember is that because stories really shape who we are and our understanding of that, there's a lot of power in stories. Stories are a powerful tool. And really the whole notion of storytelling is a lot about power. It's the people with the most power are often the people who are controlling the story and controlling the narrative. They also often are controlling that narrative and that story for a particular purpose. And this is why it's so critical that we always think critically about the stories that we're seeing, that we're hearing, that we're consuming in many different ways. There's some questions here that y'all can see on the screen that are really good questions to ask when you're consuming any kind of media. And this goes for entertainment media as well, because that is also a story. It's not just about journalism, it's about entertainment media as well. What other angles are not being considered in this story? That's a good question to always ask. Who isn't being featured? So we can see who is being featured in that story, but who isn't being featured and why are they not being featured? Who's telling this story and for what purpose are they telling that story, and how is that story being told? What details are being shared and what details are being left out? And I always like to say this last line here about stories: with great power comes great responsibility. So as storytellers, as journalists, as makers of entertainment, of TV shows and movies and things like that, there is a great responsibility, particularly in journalism and particularly in the kind of storytelling that we're doing at the Mountain Association. there's a great responsibility to tell that story in a complex way. And complex doesn't necessarily mean hard to understand. It just means that you're layering on the different understandings and the different stories about whatever issue that is, whatever topic it is that you're discussing. But it's really important as a storyteller to think about this responsibility that you have, because once you put that story out there, people are going to interpret that through the lens that they already have, and they're gonna use that story to understand the topic that you're talking about. So it's important to think about, how do you tell a story in a complex way? So I also always like to talk about the history of media in Appalachia. It's a very complex relationship, the media in Appalachia, and I always like to talk about that when I'm talking about storytelling and narrative, because it's really important to understanding this current moment that we're in. So really the history with media representation in Central Appalachia is really a 300-year-long history. We can date that history back to the first land prospectors that came into the region, looking for resources, looking for land, looking for things that they could then go back to the coasts, go back to the Northeast, and tell people this is here, let's go get it. So we can trace those stories back, and those stories, those early stories, they often talk about and describe the land and the people who were living there as being very, very rugged, very isolated, not very educated. So even those very first stories are starting to create this, what we often refer to as the hillbilly narrative of people who live in the region. And really, media extraction from this place, it happens in cycles. And these cycles tend to coincide with some kind of economic, political, or social upheaval that's happening in the larger country at the time. If we just look at the 20th century, for instance, we see a lot of media being made and being created, and a lot of stories coming out about Appalachia during the labor wars, the Union Wars of coal mining, the Battle of Blair Mountain, as I have this poster here, that kind of era. We see a lot of images and stories coming out about the region. In the Great Depression, when there was a lot of economic strife and people were really struggling, there's also a lot of stories coming out about, why are we struggling? What is the reason why we have all of this hardship? There's a lot of stories coming out of Appalachia as sort of an explanation. That also happens with the war on poverty era of the mid 20th century, when we had big name politicians. We had presidents visiting. LBJ came to Martin County, Kentucky, and he announced the war on poverty from Tom Fletcher's porch in Martin County. And there was a reason for that. There was a reason why he came to Eastern Kentucky, to Central Appalachia, to have that be the backdrop for the war on poverty. During the Great Recession in the 2010s, 20-teens, that's the era of Appalachian reality TV shows. We're seeing a lot of that. And then on up into 2016 with the Trump getting elected, we had this whole narrative about Trump country that was coming out. So there are these cycles that happen, and we can sort of trace the stories. And also, I think, as a lot of people who study Appalachia and who are from the region will know, that these cycles of media extraction have really led to a lot of stereotypes and a lot of oversimplification of what this place and the people who live here are. So why does that matter? Why is that important? Well, that oversimplification really leads to this sense of dehumanization of the people who live in this place. And if people can see that if the idea that the people who live in Eastern Kentucky, Central Appalachia, are backward, are not educated, aren't willing to modernize and come into the modern day, then they start to understand this place and the people here as not really being worth saving. And so then this exploitation that happens of the resources, of the labor, of the images, that can happen as a result of that. It sort of fits in with this narrative that is already existing, that was created by powerful people for a purpose. And that purpose was to allow for resource extraction that was largely unregulated. And it allowed for this mono economy to take hold, that we're now trying to, we've been pushed up against a wall with this mono economy to the point where we're now trying to push back and do something different. But we have these stories that we have to contend with, and this narrative that we have to contend with. And those stories don't really allow the new ideas and different ideas to flourish. It's really hard to convince people when the people and the places sort of being positioned as outside of that dominant culture. The belief is over time that they aren't worth investment because they aren't even willing to help themselves. And so we shouldn't try to invest in them and help them. And it's really hard in that kind of landscape to help these new ideas and these new stories flourish. So now, we're in this era of oversimplification in media and in our stories and in what we're consuming. And we have these media cycles that are just, it seems like every hour on the hour, we have a new headline, we have new breaking news. There's barely any room to breathe in between those breaking news headlines. So there is definitely not room for added complexity about those stories that they're sharing. We also sort of live in this era now of this social media echo chamber where, you are able to mute certain stories and certain words that you don't want to see on your Twitter timeline, or you can only be friends with certain people and then mute other people on your Facebook feed, so that you're only seeing a lot of times stories that already reinforce the worldview that you already have. And then, this all sort of this oversimplification and not really seeing all sides of an issue and all sides of a story, not having those layers of complexity, it really leads to this either or dichotomy about certain issues and certain people and places. And that either or lack of critical thinking about these stories that we're consuming, it really leads to, over time, your imagination muscles sort of get into this point of atrophy where it's a lot harder for you to imagine yourself into other people's shoes, or to imagine other aspects of a certain issue in a way that really creates a sense of understanding. It just becomes harder over time. So then, if this is sort of where we're at, what do we do? How do we combat this oversimplification? How do we walk ourselves back from this or forward from this? So I think the first thing to remember is that a lot of media, a lot of journalism, really this tenet of journalism is that it must be objective. It must adhere to both sides. We got to hear from both sides. But really this idea of both sides-ism, it reduces the amount of complexity because it sort of drowns out the layers that you could have to this story. And it also is considering that all sides deserve an equal voice. And that's not always the case. And it doesn't consider the fact that publications and journalists always have a point of view. And it's really hard to not have that point of view come into your story and to come into the things that you're putting out there. And it's also true that objectivity in this sort of both sides-ism that we're seeing and that, has been built up in journalism, it wasn't always a part of journalism, that wasn't always there. But when it started to come out is when they could see, the powerful people who controlled media could see that objectivity really helped the status quo remain the status quo. And it really creates this vacuum of diverse stories. So the other thing to remember is that we always have to seek the true truth. And what I mean by that is truth there is hardly ever, if ever, one single truth about something. There are multiple truths and multiple layers to things. There are complexities and complications and varied stories from multiple angles. One issue seen by someone from Appalachia, for instance, will be seen very different from someone who lives in an urban area. And what I like to call this notion of seeking the true truth is the truth prism. So what I mean by that is that you take a lot of different stories about a single topic or a single issue from lots of different angles, and then you're able to sort of filter those through this prism. And then on the other side of that, you start to get a more complete picture of what that issue is, of what that place is, of what it's all about. And as an example of what I mean by this true truth and looking through that truth prism, I wanted to share a little bit about my own family story. So all of these things about my family are true. And they sort of, if you read them just as this, they sort of fit this idea or ideal that a lot of people have about what Appalachia is. So, my family has lived at the head of the left fork of Mesas Creek in Viper, Kentucky for 5 generations. We have lived there most of that time largely as subsistence farmers. I come from a family of that's full of loggers and coal miners, soldiers, teachers, factory workers, housewives, and carpenters. So all of these things are true about my family. However, when you start to layer on complexity and you start to dig a little deeper into that story, the land that we live on was stolen from Native Americans after the Revolutionary War and gifted to my ancestors through land grants and the Homestead Act. Women could not own that land for a really long time. And there is still a clause in my grandpa Earl's deeds to his land that I can't own that land because I'm a woman. That land can only be owned by my brother. So we were subsistence farmers, but we owned the land that we lived on. We had the deeds to that land. And so we were able to survive by being subsistence farmers because we had that land that we could use. And we were able to build generational wealth because of that ownership. So we were able to stay in this place for a really long time because we had that land and we had that generational wealth that provided us with some stability and some status. And, also, there were loggers, there were coal miners, there were teachers, there were all of these different kinds of people in my family. And there were also activists and documentarians. Those soldiers, some of them fought for the Confederacy. Others liberated concentration camps in World War II. There were civil and women's rights defenders and advocates as part of my family. There were union members, strong and proud union members. And we had a lot of strong matriarchs and a lot of really tender patriarchs. So these are some of those layers of complexity about those coal miners, about those teachers, that these things were also a part of who they were. So this is all part of complicating the narrative about something. As I said, there's no one truth about anybody or anything. So we have to, it's sort of our responsibility to complicate those narratives to make sure that we are layering on those complexities and seeking that deeper and better understanding of those stories and of those people and places. If we always hear the same simple stories that try to say there is only one truth about something, or there is an either or truth about something, we're leaving out a lot of voices. And most often the voices we're leaving out are the most marginalized people in our society. Queer folks, young folks, Black Americans, Black Appalachians, women, and people of color. Those are the people that we're not often hearing from. The oversimplified stories that have been told about Appalachia, about Eastern Kentucky, they have almost always proven to be false. We hear a lot of stories even now about industrial recruitment. We have to bring in these big job creators like Walmart or call centers that will hire, hundreds of people at one time. But what we aren't hearing about those stories is that most often those kinds of industries will stay in a place as long as they can get tax breaks And then as soon as those tax breaks are gone, they leave. They lay off all of the workers and they leave, and they haven't built any kind of sustainable economy in this place. So really, I mean, there's this question of like, what new stories about community and economy can we tell that will help us build something new and something different? What new stories can we put out there so that people are seeing those stories and hearing those stories, not necessarily instead of these stories about big job creators, but in addition to? It's all about layering that complexity on. You know, if we keep hearing these stories and if we keep telling ourselves these stories that something can't work in this place, then it never will. You know, if we can't buy into it and if we can't invest in it, it's not going to happen. So we have to start telling those different stories so that we can actually make these new things a possibility. And as I have tried to say, news stories are vital. They are critical, especially now in this moment where, you know, before COVID, we were trying to build a new economy in this place in Eastern Kentucky for a really long time. And now in this moment of COVID, there's a lot of struggle out there, and there's a lot of people who are worried about what's going to happen. So we've got to start telling these new stories. We've got to be relentless in the belief that new stories are real and attainable. We have to be committed to complexity that is rooted in reality and a diverse, multi-layered truth. We have to abandon those stories, those old stories that have been told about us and our place and what we're worth. And we have to start creating and capturing new and different stories. And those stories need to be stories that are based in hope, inclusion, diversity, and community. And those stories have to be ones that better reflect our deep values in this place and our deep values of building a new economy in this place and what that looks like. And how are we going to invest in that and teach our children about that? How are we going to build a sustainable, resilient economy in this place that works for all people, not just a handful of people? So we do this because those new stories really do light the path. Those tangible examples prove that something more sustainable is possible. And if we can reveal those layers of the known stories, like the stories of my own family, then it adds some dimension, and it can prove to ourselves and to others that we aren't just one thing. We are many things. We are multiple things. And because we are multiple things, we can do multiple things in this place to help build that new economy. And we have examples of this throughout Appalachian history. Appalachian history is full of complex stories. I mentioned those Union Wars of the early 20th century, but they also happened in the mid to late 20th century, where we were having battles over coal mine strikes, especially in Harlan County. We had women in both Knott County and Harlan County in the 60s, 70s, and 80s who were chaining themselves to bulldozers. And these weren't outside people who were coming from faraway cities. They were people who lived in that holler, who didn't want to see what was happening. And so they chained themselves to those bulldozers so they could stop it from happening. There are Black coal miners. Oftentimes when we have heard these stories about Trump country or Appalachia, Eastern Kentucky, we don't hear about Black coal miners. We don't hear about all of the other people of color who worked in the coal mines. We hear one story about what that was. We don't hear a lot about LGBT or queer youth in the region. And that is like a huge part of our population in Eastern Kentucky. West Virginia has, if not the highest concentration, one of the highest concentrations of trans youth in the country. And we don't often hear that story about this place. So the thing that we have to do is we have to tell our stories, and we have to tell them true. We have to add more voices to those stories and to stories about a particular issue, so that we're challenging perceptions and we're challenging that status quo. We're challenging that old narrative about what this place is, and we're diversifying who gets to tell those stories so that we're not always hearing from the same kind of people or one particular person. We have to be careful to not fall into the trap of these quick fix stories. So, you know, those stories about industrial recruitment, for instance, it sounds really good that, you know, we're going to create 500 jobs in a community, but what are the layers to that? At what cost? How long are they going to be there? Those kinds of things. We have to always question the stories that we're consuming. And we have to be complex and multifaceted in the stories that we're telling. We have to add those layers and then add some more and then add some more. We have to always be seeking that true truth and filtering all of those stories through that truth prism. So we're finding that deeper, more accurate, more complete understanding of an issue or of people or places. So this complexity, it really leads to people having a stronger imagination muscle and people being able to think about what are all the possibilities that we could do here? What are our opportunities? We see that these stories exist. How can we do that in our place? And then that imagination and asking those questions and investing in those new and different ideas, that is what leads to a better future in this place and in any place. So just to return to the story of my Granny Della, you know, the rest of her story, she was a fiery person, and she would defend her family and her people and her place against anybody, obviously. But she was really complex. And, you know, the stories that she had been told as a young girl in her youth were stories that were very limiting. She heard those stories consistently, and they were reinforced consistently for her. And so she believed that she had to fit into this life that was already laid out for her. She believed that her only options were to be a housewife and a mother, because those were the only stories that she'd ever been told. And so when she started to imagine new stories for herself, she started to see that there was actually more that she could be doing. You know, when she was in her 40s, she got her driver's license, she got her GED. When she was a young girl, she played piano. She wanted to move to a big city and play music as her career. But she was able to keep playing music. And she found these ways to change her story and to change her narrative. And she told those stories, those new and different stories, to her daughter. You can see here. My mother, Pamela Brashear, and she told her new stories and expanded her worldview by degrees. And, you know, those stories then were being told to me as a young person and as a child, that the possibilities were endless, that I could do anything and be anything. And again, that's the power of these stories that we tell. If we limit ourselves to one or two different stories and we don't see the full breadth of those stories, then we limit ourselves. We limit what we think is possible for ourselves, but also for our communities and the world around us. And so it's really just about what are those new and different stories? How can we change our narrative so that we're adding layers and complexities all the time, so that we see the possibilities in a new and different way, and we're able to build something new and build something different that maybe we couldn't have even imagined unless we were getting all of those stories about that thing and filtering them through that truth prism to find that deeper understanding. So here's all of my contact info. You know, I am always happy to talk about stories and narrative. And we at the Mountain Association have been very intentionally over the past couple years trying to collect as many stories as we possibly can about building this new economy in Eastern Kentucky. And you can find all those stories on our website. We have a very extensive blog there where we keep all those stories. So with that, I'm gonna pass it back over to you, Chris, to field some questions.
Well, I want to encourage, first of all, hooray! If we were in a group of people, we would be hearing the applause. And I don't know, I know a lot of the people who are out there watching, And I'm just imagining them doing the same thing I did. Here I am with my little notes. I got my little yee-hoos, my oh yeah, my hallelujahs going on, and questions. And so as folks are thinking about those questions, you get a chance to reflect on them. Please share them in the question and answer, and then I'll bring them up for Ivy. And I invite you too to think about how you can switch your screen. Ivy, if you stop sharing your screen now, I think we can go into full mode too. Because we have some answers there. And I see there's one question coming in. So here's a question. I'm just going to read it out loud. This comes from Jasmine Jones, who's a professor here at Berea College. I love these ideas about creating new stories and exercising the imagination muscle. However, I can see the idea of abandoning the old stories can be controversial. As we've seen with the vehemence around Confederate monuments, do you have any thoughts or examples about the process of abandonment?
Yeah, I have some thoughts about it. I think perhaps abandonment is a stronger word than what really needs to happen. I think, I am a storyteller, so sometimes I like to use those strong words to make a strong point. I don't think it's necessarily that we abandon those stories entirely and ignore them and forget about them. But what I do think is that we abandon the notion that it is that one story that is true. And so what we have to do, if we're thinking about Confederate monuments, for instance, what we have to do is then add those layers of what it really means that that Confederate monument exists. What is the time and place that that was created? Why was it created? Who was creating that monument? What voices are we not hearing when people are talking about this controversy over removing Confederate monuments? Are we only hearing from one side of this story? And if we're hearing from both sides, are we not hearing enough from one or the other? I think it's less about, we need to just abandon that entire history and that whole story. And it's more about adding those layers to it. I think that's the key there. So that it's not just about an either or dichotomy, but it's a multi-layered story, a multi-layered issue that's very complex.
Ivy, how would you do that with some of the bigger issues, which are particular, especially in Eastern Kentucky, like around coal?
Mm-hmm.
How is that issue of those layers of complexity? Then it's been an ongoing work. But what are some of the recent ways that that's come to your attention with making that a more complex story?
I mean, I think one that's coming to mind right now are the recent miner protests in Harlan and Perry counties. The miners had been laid off. They had mined a bunch of coal, and the company was trying to take that coal and sell it and not pay them for the work that they had done. And so those coal miners said, we're not going to stand for this. And they went to the railroad tracks and they stayed there for days before they would relent. They wanted to be paid for the work that they had done. And I think that is a layer of complexity around this issue of coal and coal's collapse in the region that we did hear a lot about at the time. But when the collapse was first starting to happen, we were only hearing this one story about we can't do anything else here. We don't have anything else that we can do. People in the region were sort of parroting those stories of like, what else do we have if we don't have coal? And so I think like one layer of complexity is that protests that happen. It's also trying to show folks what is already happening in the region in terms of building a new economy, investment in local businesses, investment in new energy and energy efficiency. All of those things are also happening, and we just don't see a lot about that. And that's actually been a lot of our work in the past few years at Mountain Association. We've been trying to get those stories out there and trying to say, these things are already happening. It's not something that we have to create new out of whole cloth. It's just something that you maybe have not heard about. Let's invest more in it. So that's kind of the thing with coal is like, we're trying to say, these things are happening. They are real. They are tangible. We can do more of this.
Well, there's another question, and that is about some of the positive stories. And it sounds like you're giving an example of some of those positive stories here. Can you share one or two with a little bit more detail with our audience?
Yeah, sure. I can definitely do that. So one of my favorite stories, I'll do a couple, but one of my favorite is of Gwen Christian. She is the owner of Awesome IGA in Letcher County. And Awesome is a small community just outside of Whitesburg. It's about 10 miles outside of Whitesburg, the county seat. And this grocery store, she worked there as a clerk. She worked her way up to become the owner. She was starting to see that her energy bills were just astronomical. So she actually worked with us at Mountain Association to upgrade her lighting, upgrade her cooler systems, do a lot of those kinds of improvements, and was saving a lot of money. She was saving enough money on her energy bill that she was able to hire new employees. She could stock her shelves with local produce, which she couldn't do before. She was able to keep her doors open in a community that otherwise wouldn't have access to this kind of fresh food and to a grocery store even. And now she's even trying to install solar on her building. She's hoping to do that now as another way to cost save. And then another one also comes from Letcher County, and it's the Cowan Creek Community Center, where they have the Black Sheep Bakery. Gwen Johnson there, who has operated the community center, has also invested a lot in energy efficiency and new energy as a way to save money and keep her doors open on this community center that really provides a third space for that community where they have music and singing and dancing. And the Black Sheep Bakery actually employs people who are in drug recovery to give them an opportunity and a job and to learn some job skills. So those are two of those complex stories that I could talk about for a really long time, but those are two of my favorites that I like to bring up.
People should definitely write down Cowan Creek, especially just write down Cowan Creek and Google it. It is a remarkable people, just remarkable people, good tomatoes, good music, good people. Here's a question that comes in, and this is one I'm thinking about with Letcher County too. And it says that the person asking this question says that sometimes you said that both sides are not equal sides, right? It's that false dichotomy. All sides need to be heard. However, what do we do in circumstances when those members who have negative views or oppressive views are part of a community conversation? How do we exclude those stories from the conversation? How can we make sure that that's part of the diversity? I'm thinking with Letcher County because of the issues about the prison complex to go in. For folks who don't know about it, there's been a real debate in Letcher County about diversifying the economy and the possibility of putting in a federal maximum security prison on an old mountaintop removal site, which is a lot of people are against. So how do you work when you have people of really different views and some of which are pretty oppressive?
Yeah, I mean, I think in a community context, especially, you have to work with those people because they're a part of your community, and they're gonna either push against you or they're gonna work with you. In a small community like Whitesburg, that's definitely true. I mean, it's true everywhere, but there especially, I think you can't avoid people in a small community. But I think what you have to do in those situations where there is perhaps an oppressive view or someone who holds those opinions that are not the opinions you're trying to advance or the story that you're trying to advance. I think that you have to just have those hard conversations with them in that community context. If you're going to be working with this person, you can't just ignore them. You can't just push them aside. And I certainly don't advocate for that. But what I do advocate for is having those hard conversations and trying to meet people where they are so that, you can see each other from across the line that you've drawn in the sand, and you can understand that, in your community, you're both people who ultimately you want the same thing. You want the same goal. You want to do what's best for your place and build that sustainable economy there. So where can you meet in the middle and have some compromises about that? Now, I think in stories and in journalism, I think it's a little different. I think that it's important to hear from all sides. However, I don't think that means that all sides need to have the same amount of space, particularly if you're talking about issues of social justice. I don't think the oppressor needs to have the same amount of space as the oppressed. I just think that's counterintuitive to social justice and to letting them have voice and say in this issue that affects them, whoever the them is. So I think it's a little different in journalism, but I do think in the community context, you just have to have those conversations with people, and it won't be easy. It'll be really hard and difficult, but actually in Letcher County, they have had what is called the Letcher County Culture Hub as an example, where they have lots of different people from lots of different businesses, organizations, lots of different status in life who came together to think about what is the future here. And they had those hard conversations many times and found a way to compromise and work through that and still build toward their ultimate goal.
It sounds like in that case too, it's where they are able to engage the complexity of a situation in a story.
Exactly.
Building those shared stories together as well, and understanding how those stories are being co-built in that way.
Yes.
And that's the best case in a community.
Mm-hmm.
But that takes a lot of work. As you said, it takes a whole lot of work.
Yes. It takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of time. A lot of the work that we do as Mountain Association is that, we're going to people and we're having those conversations. We're listening, doing a lot of listening. Sometimes we're having those hard conversations. But, when we're working with people, we're not trying to tell them what to do. We're trying to have a conversation with them about what they want and trying to help them achieve that.
Here's a question, which is pretty, one with not an easy answer because it's a complex question. And this, I'll just read the question out loud and then give a little my understanding of the gloss on it. Do you find any challenges regarding the layers of complexity with council culture? And for those folks, this is a term that has been thrown out broadly, but there is a sense of where there is a silencing of people going on because of what they have said. And what they have said being in disagreement with the Twitter atmosphere. And this is the most crass version of it. And so there's a lot of fear about being shut down. Recently, there was an article that came out in Harper's Magazine of people of very different views on everything. Things certainly views people who I don't hold, saying there needs to be more inclusive vision. But yet the accusation, as I understand it, is that particularly progressive radical movements can easily silence those within their own ranks when there is a statement of disagreement. So again, it's a complex issue, but do you find any challenges regarding layers of complexity in the council culture?
Yes, yes, I do. I mean, I think it all goes back to this notion that we live in this era now where we don't have to listen to opposing views if we don't want to. We can turn off the news. We can turn off the Facebook feed. We can only follow certain people on Twitter, and people who often only reinforce our own worldview that we already have. And I think that, because of that, we're just like moving further and further away from each other, and it's getting harder and harder to have those hard conversations like in this community context, because if you're seeing and consuming media all day that just reinforces what you already believe and doesn't really challenge what you believe, and this goes for all sides of a political spectrum or any kind of spectrum of belief, then you're gonna start to think that like whatever opposing view there is can't possibly have any merit. Now, in some cases, I think like in very extreme cases, this idea of cancel culture and making sure that we don't hear from certain people is warranted in very extreme cases. But I think mostly people are we have gotten out of learning how to listen to one another and learning how to like see each other as people and trying to meet in the middle somewhere and meet people where they are and have a real conversation instead of just completely writing someone off because they have a viewpoint that is so totally out of the realm of what we believe personally. I mean, if I were to cancel people in my family who have very extreme views on mask wearing, for instance, I wouldn't talk to 70% of my family ever. And I just think, I'm not willing to be like that with people that I know, but also with people that I think are just as wrapped up in this echo chamber as the rest of us. You know, they're also not seeing ideas and viewpoints that are different than their own. And so we're just sort of in these either or camps all the time about all different kinds of issues. And it's become really hard for us to cross those lines. So yeah, I think it just goes back to that whole echo chamber notion of where we are in the world with media consumption right now.
So I hear you saying, yes, there are some challenges.
Yes, there are challenges, yes.
But I think that at the core, what you're also sharing is that it's about a chance to speak and to listen.
Yeah.
And there's difficulty as our lives are both more rushed. There's greater stress of income inequality. And also we can get into those echo chambers too.
Yeah, definitely. That's definitely true.
Here's a good question, and maybe we'll take one more question after this one. And this one again is from Jasmine, and this is, do you have examples of youth or students participating in the storytelling process with the Mountain Association? Because our future is with the youth. Can you share with us some of those stories?
Yeah, definitely. Those are my favorite stories. So there are lots of instances of youth of all different kinds who are creating their own stories and putting them out there. And one of my favorite is out of Appalachia in Whitesburg. It's the Appalachian Media Institute, which is a summer program for youth. I think the age is 16 to 25, but I may be off about that. But it's young people from the region. And they come into this program and they learn how to become documentarians and how to tell stories about their place and the people around them and their communities. And the stories that they create, the films that they create at the end of this summer series program are just, I mean, they're some of the most powerful stories that you will see about modern day Appalachia and Eastern Kentucky. Highly encourage folks to look them up and seek out those stories because they're really incredible. But we also at Mountain Association specifically, one other thing I wanted to say about AMI, the Appalachian Media Institute, is that they have done an audio series this summer about COVID and about how COVID is impacting their communities, how the pandemic is impacting mental health, all of these different things. So those are really great and everybody should seek those out too. But at Mountain Association, what we've done is we've tried to put an emphasis on reaching out to youth organizations like the Stay Project, which now has an organization, a sub-organization for Black Appalachian youth. And we have reached out to those kinds of organizations and those people who are in those organizations to get their stories and work with them to tell their stories through our platforms. There are also stories out of Grayson, Kentucky, where the young people there wanted a place where they could go and be and hang out, after school and on weekends and things like that. So they created a youth center there, which is now doing a lot of arts programs for the kids there. So there's a lot of stories. I mean, I think some of the most powerful stories that I'm seeing now are about young people in the region who are doing these kinds of things, but also, holding vigils for Black lives in Corbin, and hosting marches and protests for Black Lives Matter in Hazard and Whitesburg, and just really leading the way and complexifying the story of this place all the time, constantly.
Absolutely, and those are inspirational things. I hope that I think our listeners can feel the inspiration, that Ivy's showing us, and I'm feeling from this as well. And I'm thinking about the work that people did, especially around Black Lives Matters in Eastern Kentucky, and people really standing up and coming out in ways that I think sadly surprised the nation, but lovely showed the nation how many people know the consequences of the situation of our larger culture that need to be addressed in those places too with it. Well, are there any final questions that folks would like to ask? I know that folks will need to be taken off here to maybe use the restroom before their 1 o'clock meetings. And seeing none, well, Ivy, I would really like to, I thank you so much for coming and sharing this time with us and of helping people learn about Stuart Hall, who is a champion that we should all have t-shirts of. And I see people saying thank you on there in chats. And so again, thank you so much, Abby. I invite people to go look at the Mountain Association and learn more about the amazing and deep work they're doing with advocacy in the State House of Kentucky, with loans going out to people, a really amazing thing. And Ivy, thank you so much for opening us up about stories.
Thank you so much for having me. I was happy to be here.